This is a quick tour around the segment editor to show you what the buttons do and do not do. The first thing I'll talk about is the file menu and the edit menu. Ignore new segment. It's better to leave the segment editor and to rerun it, simply because there is a danger that you'll overwrite an old segment that you may wish to keep. Open segment will open a segment that you've previously saved. Save segment saves the current work on a current segment that you're working on. Save segment as will save the segment under a new file name, and I recommend you use this the first time you want to create a segment file, an FPS file. Import mesh. This is exactly the same as the mesh button over here that's discussed extensively in previous tutorials. Return to map editor you should ignore. It's a feature that isn't yet available. Exit will terminate this tool. The edit menu doesn't work at all, and you should use the Control-C and Control-V keys instead. The mesh button will load up the browser into the mesh library area, which allows you to select a mesh. So for the purposes of this demonstration, we load in the wall and leave it in our editing environment. CSG button will load up the browser to select a mesh for the purpose of CSG, constructive solid geometry. For this, we'll select a mesh typically used for CSG, which is doorpunch.x. We click OK, and it loads in the CSG mesh. And for fun, if we press the tab key, you'll notice what the CSG mesh does. It actually cuts a hole into any meshes that get in its path. If we didn't want that to happen, I'll press tab again, click the wall, press the I key. You'll notice the list it now says no CSG, and press the tab key again. The CSG mesh does nothing because the wall is now immune. So I press tab, press I once more to remove that mode, press tab, and it's as before. Now the opposite of CSG punch, we click that mesh, you'll notice we have a weld button. If we click the weld button, it changes green and it has the words weld written on it. If we press tab now, see what happens. It actually welds the CSG mesh to the wall. This is effectively one mesh now. So we can click tab to go back into the edit mode. We can move the wall to the north direction and move the CSG to protrude out of the wall. The only rule with weld is that the weld mesh must touch the other mesh that it's going to weld onto. So we press tab. As you can see, if you run this within your game, it would be a large block protruding out of the wall. So that's the main purpose of the weld mode. The next button, NA, is non-functional and isn't working in this version of the tool. The add entity, as shown in a previous tutorial, will bring in an entity and associate it with the segment. So we only have one in this demonstration called my door, which is an entity representing an animating door, which we'll open and close by sliding. The right mouse button allows you to rotate any item. So we can rotate the door and use the animate once to view the entity's animation, as we also saw in a previous tutorial. We can use the right mouse button to rotate the wall even, and we can use the right mouse button to rotate the CSG mesh. And if we press tab, you'll notice how the CSG is exactly the same, and if we press punch, you'll notice how the CSG cuts exactly that shape out of the wall. So this rotate mode can be useful for creating more interesting segment tiles. This list here represents the individual items that you have in the editing space at the moment. As you can see, we've got a wall X file, we've got the CSG mesh, the punch, and the entity. And this list will grow as the number of items increase naturally. And you'll get a scroll bar when the list exceeds the available space on screen. The up, down, and sort buttons simply repositions the order of these items if you're a stickler for neatness and want all your meshes in one group and your CSGs in another and your entities in a third, etc. So we wanted our entity to be the first item in the list. We click it once, click the up button twice, and you'll now notice that the entity is now first in the list. Again, if we click wall and we wanted that as the last item in the list, we click down. And once you're happy with the new order, you click the sort button. And what the sort button does is crash. This illustrates the fragile nature of an internal development tool. The moral of the story is do not press the sort button. So to continue explaining the buttons, the next few panels are merely information readouts which show you the X, Y and Z coordinates, and in this box here the rotational angle of the item that you're editing. Change mesh, change texture and change effect were discussed in previous tutorials. But what wasn't discussed is the C button alongside. The C stands for clear, and you can use that to wipe out any selection you've made. So if you change a texture and you don't like it, you can press the C button to clear that texture, or click change texture again to replace one texture with another. For the sake of this demonstration, I'll load in a segment I have created previously called myroom.fps, which will load in a segment which is 4 walls and a floor. This illustrates the next part of the panel, which is the visibility. These numbers represent the ID of the individual items. So this wall here is wall number 3. This wall here is wall number 4. This wall number 1. This wall number 2, and the floor is item 0. These numbers were created using the calculate visibility button. The C represents clear, so you can clear the visibility information, and clicking the calculate visibility assigns these numbers automatically. The numbers relate to the direction of the individual items in relation to the center of the segment, and is used internally to calculate visibility when combining segments to create a larger room. The O button represents the overlay feature, overlay direction, overlay full, or no overlay. The overlay was discussed in the tutorial which explains how to create a simple door. The last part of the panel is the blueprint, and this is an indicator to the FPS Creator level editor as to how this segment should be represented. The default is room, so when you are painting the segment into the level editor, the segment will be represented as a room, and a room is typically a floor with 4 walls. If you press the arrow, you can select the segment as a floor, and the floor is very simply the segment as a floor with no walls. So this would be typically a floor segment, and we choose floor and then save as segment. The difference between room and floor is that the floor doesn't have any walls, and so when this is illustrated in the level editor in blueprint mode, it will just do a floor and not draw a blueprint wall. You have others, external. Those are for segments that don't necessarily have an identity and will be represented in the blueprint again as a simple floor tile in the blueprint section of the level editor. The next few options represent corridor pieces. So a straight would represent an arrow facing north-south. A corner would be an arrow that's pointing south and east. A T-junction, as you might expect, is an arrow facing east-west with a southerly arrow. And all these arrows will be familiar to you as you use the corridor segments of the level editor. Cross junction is arrows going in all four directions, and dead end is an arrow facing south with the northerly direction blocked. And these illustrations are the actual cursor patterns that you'll see in the level editor. So that's what this last panel represents. The status bar along the bottom provides some useful information. The segment that you're working on, very important if you want to use the save segment, because if you are actually editing one segment and then you switch to another, make doubly sure that the segment you think you're working on is also written here. Otherwise you'll be overwriting the wrong segment and you'll lose some of your work. Instructions on how to use the arrow keys to move the camera. Left mouse button drags items, so we can drag it around. The shadow is useful in this single pane 3D editing to know exactly where you are in 3D space. You'll notice it also locks to directions. The right mouse button rotates. The comma and full stop keys block rotate, which was introduced in the simple room segment tutorial. If you press and hold the shift key and then use the left mouse button, it will lock the segment so it can only be adjusted along the Y. This is very useful if you want to load in a floor mesh and then maneuver it to the floor. The reason why this is necessary is as the cursor moves down the screen, the editor might think you want to move in a southerly direction, but this isn't the case. You just want to move up and down. So keep the shift key pressed down if you want that to be the case. There are a couple of other attributes that can be associated with each item you bring into your segment. The first one, let's put this back so it's a nice simple floor, and you can use the camera rotation to make your editing placement a little more intuitive. So you can see how the shadow is lining up with the center, so we now know that's nice and centered. So we can hold down the shift key, left mouse button, and bring it right back into the center. Now the next key I want to introduce is the C key. Now take note, in the list it's got a P in brackets. That means polygons, and it means polygons that are going to be used for the collision. But if your mesh has lots of polygons, that's a very inefficient way to do the collision data for this individual mesh. So what you can do is press the C key and it changes to B. That means box. So it's going to use a very fast form of collision where it wraps the whole mesh up in a box, and so when you use that in your game, when you're standing on this particular piece of floor, your collision, for the floor at least, is very fast. If you press C again, it switches to R, and R means a reduced mesh. So if you've got something like a door frame, which is quite high in polygons, but it's a simple shape, which is essentially a box on the left, a box on the right, and then a box above you, then that's a kind of simple shape. And the engine has a way of reducing a highly complex polygon mesh into a very simple set of boxes. So that's what the R represents. But it's not always reliable, so for this particular mode, my best advice is a bit of trial and error. If you press C again, it goes to NC, which means no collision, which is also something you might want to consider. If you place a door down and you place a CSG mesh, which is going to punch through a wall, you may not want the door frame to have any collision whatsoever, because the wall and the hole being punched through it may be collision data enough, and the small difference that you'll get as you push through the door may not matter if the door frame is colliding with the player or not. And if you press C again, you go back to P, which is the default collision setting. So I highly recommend that after you've created your room segments that you change all the P's to B's, because you get a faster collision environment when you finally play the game. So that is the C key. The I key I have already explained, which allows you to set the mesh so it ignores all CSG activity. So if you set the mesh to no CSG, you cannot weld to it and you cannot punch holes through it. The next one is M, which is called multi-mesh, and what this is used for is if you have a mesh called, for example, my room floor underscore a.x, if you also have a model called floor underscore b.x and floor underscore c.x, multi-mesh will randomly choose between those three meshes and then randomly place that selection in your final universe build. This is a way of defeating the tiling effect you get by lots of very similar meshes being placed to create a very large room. And this feature also extends to textures. If I select change texture, it takes me to the browser and I show you the wall texture. We have w underscore a underscore all underscore o1 underscore d2. The important part of that file name is the o1. If you also add a texture called o2 and o3 to run alongside that texture, the multi-mesh would randomly choose between o1, o2 and o3, and again defeat that tiling effect that you're going to get in the final game environment. So that demonstrates what the M key is. The final two keys are the B and N keys. And what these are used for is to assign the material index to the individual items of your segment. Now if I press the B key several times, nothing happens. Again, I must warn you, this is an internal development tool. What you have to do is to click the mesh and then press B and N. And you'll notice in the list there's a new bracket called M1. Press N key, it goes to M2. Press the N key again, it goes to M3, and so on and so forth. And the number represents the material that the floor is made out of. Why is that important, you ask? Because the engine will automatically add the extra gain elements you're going to need when you walk on that floor and when you shoot that floor. So if you walk along it and the segment is made of metal, it will make a metal sound. If it's made of wood, it makes a wood sound. When you have no material, it makes a very, very soft, quiet sound, almost inaudible. M1 represents the default material, which is slightly louder. M2 represents stone, so it's a very chalky sound effect. M3 represents metal, and M4 represents wood. There's quite a large number of materials, and you'll be able to find the names of those materials elsewhere in the FPS Creator folder structure, and you can find the location of that in the FAQ provided with this tutorial. Now that is all the keys that are used in the current version of the segment editor.